So, friends, by any measure, by any reckoning, by any accounting, one Dr. Christina Lee and one Dr. Freya Harrison, you would have to call them nerds of the highest order. And I don't use the word nerd in a derogatory fashion at all, because here at Hillside Community Church, there's one thing that brings us together and unites us, perhaps more than anything else. It is our thoroughgoing conviction that great work can be accomplished, that great power can be unleashed in the world whenever, wherever, two or more nerds are gathered together. Can I get an amen? Amen, amen. And today I want to talk to you about the great work accomplished by these two particular nerds. So Dr. Christina Lee, she is a historian and an expert in the field of Viking studies. That is Viking as in horned hat wearing, dragon boat sailing, village pillaging Vikings. But as a hobby, as a side passion of hers, she is extremely interested in the field of microbiology. Right, so already the nerdiness is strong in that one. But then let me tell you about Dr. Freya Harrison. Because Dr. Freya Harrison is a microbiologist by trade, but as a hobby, as a side interest, she is extremely interested in Viking history. To the extent that she was actually active in a Viking-themed LARPing community. If you don't know what LARPing is, it's an acronym standing for live action role playing. So essentially, this is a group of people who dress up in Viking costumes, head to a nearby soccer field, and have at each other with replica Viking weapons. Apparently, it's a thing that people do. No judgment here. Maybe a little judgment here, but not a lot. Not a lot. But in any case, this Dr. Lee and this Dr. Harrison first crossed paths when they were professors over there at the University of Nottingham across the pond in England. And of course, they did not meet somewhere normal like a faculty meeting. Rather, they met at an Old English reading group. That is a group for people who were interested in reading for fun, in their spare time, texts that were written in Old English. Apparently, that is also a thing that people do. But after Dr. Lee and Harrison met and discovered that they were kindred spirits with such complementary specialties and hobbies, they thought it would be fun to collaborate on a research project together. And as it happened, around about that time, the British Library had just digitized and made publicly available an 1100-year-old book called Bald's Leech Book. Bald's Leech Book. Bald being a person's name and not an adjective referring to a member of the follically challenged community. And Leech Book just being Old English for medicine book. So what Bald's Leech Book was a Viking healer's handbook chock full of potions and cures for all sorts of ailments. And as you might be able to imagine, for a medical book written 1100 years ago, most of the remedies in it are just as wild as you might expect them to be. For instance, if you were experiencing a swelling somewhere, Bald recommends that you remove the canine tooth from a fox, a live fox, and press it against the affected area. Presumably on the next page it told you how to deal with a fox bite. If you have a nasty nosebleed, he says the trick is for someone to stick a piece of barley in your ear without you noticing. And if you're suffering from a case of general lunacy, he says that a good thrashing with a whip made of porpoise skin, that is just what the doctor ordered. Now, standing where we are, sophisticated modern people that we are, with all sorts of amazing double-blind tested, scientifically proven medications available to us, it's easy for us to look down our noses at this book full of wacky, weird, and pretty questionable remedies. But Dr. Lee and Dr. Harrison, they stayed curious. They wanted to see if there was a scientific basis for at least some of Bald's bizarre remedies. And so they read through this book together, painstakingly translating each and every page until they discovered a recipe that Bald used to treat eye infections. And so Dr. Lee and Dr. Harrison, they decided that they wanted to try to make this medicine and test it to see if it had any antibiotic properties whatsoever. So they set about gathering all the ingredients they needed. The recipe called for garlic, for onion, for wine, and ox gall, which is apparently it's bile from a cow's stomach, all mixed together in a copper pot. But they had a lot of sleuthing to do to find ingredients that approximated what Bald himself would have used. So for example, the Old English word for onion can refer both to leeks and to onions, so they had to make two separate batches because they didn't know which one he was talking about. For the wine, they actually tracked down the monastery where Bald lived, and lo and behold, the monastery's vineyard was still in operation, so they were able to get wine from the same vineyard that Bald would have got his from. And then when it came to the copper pot that Bald specified that this mixture had to be mixed up in, perhaps unsurprisingly, no museum would lend them an ancient Viking copper pot. But after doing a little digging, they discovered that the copper of today that is most like the copper from a millennium ago is actually the copper that is used in modern plumbing. So after a quick trip to the local hardware store, they had everything they needed to get brewing. So with everything in hand, they mixed it up, and they let this concoction sit for the 9 days and the 9 nights that Bald's recipe called for. And when those 9 days and those 9 nights were over, they took their brew into the lab, and they applied it to these little globby cubes that were covered with Staphylococcus aureus, a nasty little bacteria better known to you and me as staph. So essentially what they were doing was replicating a staph infection to see if Bald's medicine would work on it. Now, it needs to be said that their greatest hope for this nerdy little experiment of theirs was that Bald's recipe would just have some measurable impact on this bacteria. If it killed 10%, even if it killed just 5%, they would have considered the experiment to be a raging success. But when they came back to the lab the next day, they came back to discover that Bald's recipe had not killed 5% of the bacteria, and had most definitely not killed 10% of the bacteria. No, it had killed it all. At least 99.99999% of this bacteria were eradicated. Dr. Lee and Dr. Harrison, of course, they did not believe what they were seeing, so they made another batch and tried their experiment again, and it worked again. And then they tried a third and a fourth and a fifth time, and each and every time, Bald's little recipe worked. It worked. Feeling a little cocky at this point, they decided to up the stakes a little bit, and they tried to apply Bald's recipe to MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, a modern superbug mostly picked up in hospitals that kills 2,000 people a year because modern medicine, for the most part, cannot touch it. And as you may be able to ascertain from the fact that I spent a good chunk of this week learning to say methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, Bald's recipe worked again. It eradicated 90% of the MRSA bacteria that it came into contact with. So in other words, this old knowledge, this old method, this old way, which to our modern minds seems such an unlikely remedy, so unlikely, in fact, that it would be easy for us to write it off as not worthy of our time and consideration, it worked. It worked. It was efficacious. It was powerful. It was potent. It was beneficial. It made a difference. It made a real difference, even in this modern world. And that, friends, that is what we are asking you to buy into this Easter morning. I imagine that a lot of you are here this morning expecting me to give you the hard sell on the historical reality of Jesus' resurrection. But I got to be honest with you, I don't care. I don't care if you believe in Jesus' resurrection or not. And I say that because the point of the resurrection, even for the earliest theologians, the folks who became the architects of what came to be known as Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox Christian belief, even for them, the point of the resurrection, its function, its significance, is that it's essentially God running up a flag as to say, pay attention. God was here. In this human life, in the person of Jesus, God was here. So pay attention to what this person said and what this person did. That's the point of the resurrection. And if we actually do that, if we let the resurrection draw our attention to Jesus' life, to what he said, and to what he did, what we find is a person who, in chapter 3 of the Gospel of Mark, describes himself and his mission in the world as this. He says that he is a plunderer. His word choice, not mine. He says that he is a plunderer who has come into the world to bind up the powers of evil. And I think we all can probably agree that that is a fairly grandiose sounding mission. It sounds like something out of one Marvel movie or another. So that's what Jesus says that his mission is. But then when we pay attention to how he actually lived out that mission, what do we see? We see this guy who traipsed around the rural backwaters of the Middle East, telling the poor that despite their material conditions, they are loved by God. We see someone who healed folk who were sick and fed folk who were hungry. We see someone who ignored traditional distinctions made between people and rubbed shoulders with those shunned by polite society. We see someone who welcomed and blessed children, someone who humbly washed the feet of his followers, and someone who, in his final moments, offered forgiveness to those who betrayed him. And while all of these small acts of love and mercy and compassion are great, they're perfectly nice things to do, they certainly don't feel like the actions of someone trying to plunder the world back from the forces of evil, do they? In fact, this morning's reading, which is the very end of the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't end in triumph. It doesn't end in glory. It ends with 3 women fleeing from the tomb and not saying a word to anyone because they were too afraid. And yet, 2,000 years later, on this sunny Sunday morning, when all of us could very well be out enjoying bottomless mimosas at Easter brunch with our friends and families, here we sit talking about Jesus and talking about those things that he said and did, all those seemingly insignificant acts of love and mercy and compassion. And in those intervening millennium, hundreds of thousands of despots and dictators and tyrants and villains and ne'er-do-wells of all stripes have risen and fallen, and they are long forgotten. And this morning, we're not talking about them, but we are still talking about Jesus. And why is that? Why is that? You're giving away my sermon, Rachel. Come on. No, it's because this old knowledge, this old method, this old way of Jesus, which to our minds seems such an unlikely remedy for the ills and evils of our modern world. So unlikely, in fact, that it would be easy for us to write it off as not worthy of our time and our consideration. It works. It works. It is efficacious It is powerful. It is potent. It is beneficial. It makes a difference, a positive difference, even in our modern world. And if we would look around us, we would see that followers of this way of Jesus are responsible for ushering untold amounts of good into this world. We see them building hospitals and orphanages and soup kitchens. We see them running charities and NGOs, lifting folk out of poverty and providing clean drinking water to villages and towns and cities. We see them protesting violence and war and genocide. We see them fighting diligently to save our environment and protect our natural resources. We see them advocating for equality and justice for all of God's children. It was Christianity, remember, that was the backbone of the civil rights movement. Yes, the followers of Jesus' way have done and continue to do untold amounts of good. Which is not to say, of course, that Christians both presently and historically aren't responsible for doing horrible things and doing them in Jesus' name. So, for example, just this year, just in the United States, 200,000, this is a real statistic, 200,000 kids, are going to be kicked out of their quote-unquote Christian homes because they come out as gay or as trans. And that is something that we need to do something more about, especially us in the progressive wings of the church. And likewise, in this country of ours, there's a particular sickness where Christianity often gets entangled with white nationalism. Right? Just this week, we saw Trump out there hawking Bibles preambled with the U.S. Constitution. It's called the God Bless the USA Bible. And the depths of all that irony, I can't even begin to plumb. But that is something that we need to work harder to change. That is a culture that we bear culpability for and that we need to work harder to change. But the good news this morning is that for every person out there actively working to subvert the mission that Jesus lived and died for, the mission that the resurrection so beautifully draws our attention to, the good news is that there is as many, if not more, followers of Jesus' way, humbly living out those small acts of love and mercy and compassion that make the world better. And the even better news this morning is that you don't need to be a nerd to be part of this grand transformative mission. All you need is a heart willing to love, hands ready to serve, and a spirit eager to follow this simple yet profoundly efficacious way of love that Jesus taught. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.